The phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, the exact time Emily Carter was usually packing her 7-year-old Chloe's school backpack while simultaneously stirring a pot of oatmeal. The morning was as ordinary as a May morning in the city could be. Birds chirped outside the window, and the oatmeal bubbled on the stove. Chloe was still asleep in her room. In half an hour, Emily would wake her, and she'd start grumbling again that she couldn't make her braid as beautiful as Jessica's from second grade. Emily pressed the answer button. "Emily Carter, née Williams?" A strange man's voice asked, dry, official, without intonation. "Yes, this is she. This is the county sheriff's department. I need to inform you about an incident that occurred last night. Your husband, Andrew Carter, was involved in a traffic collision. Unfortunately, he was pronounced dead at the scene." The pot of oatmeal continued to simmer. In the next room, Chloe turned over, murmuring something in her sleep. Emily stood by the stove, unable to process what had just happened. It was as if the English language had suddenly taken on a new, unfamiliar meaning, and her brain refused to decipher it. "Could you please repeat that?" she said quietly. The man repeated it, just as dry, just as official. Emily turned off the stove. Andrew had left on a business trip 2 days ago, to the next state over, for the construction firm where he worked as a foreman. Nothing unusual. These trips happened 3 or 4 times a year. He was supposed to be back on Friday. Today was Wednesday. "Where do I need to go?" Emily asked, her voice surprisingly steady. She was surprised by it herself. They gave her the address of the medical examiner's office, explained that an identification was necessary, asked her to bring her ID and her husband's documents, if she had them on hand. Emily ended the call and stared at the stove for a few seconds, seeing nothing. "Mom, what's wrong?" Chloe appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her braid a mess. "You're so pale." "Everything's fine," Emily said. "Go wash up. I'm going to take you to Grandma's now. You'll go to school with her." "And you?" "I have to run some errands." Chloe looked at her seriously, with that peculiar childhood focus that sometimes unnerves adults with its accuracy. 7-year-olds don't yet know how to pretend everything is okay when it isn't. But they sense flawlessly when adults are the ones pretending. Chloe stood for another second, then silently turned and went to the bathroom. Emily watched her go and took a deep breath. She dialed her mother's number. Helen Peterson lived a 10-minute walk away, in the same part of town she had moved to years ago to be closer to her daughter. She was 62. She had been a widow for 8 years, and knew how to take bad news the way only people whom life has already broken once, and who still manage to stand, can. When Emily told her the essential part over the phone, Helen was silent for 3 seconds, exactly as long as she needed to compose herself. "I'm leaving now," she said. "Don't go without me." But Emily couldn't wait. It was stronger than her. This feeling that she had to move immediately, that standing still was physically impossible. By the time her mother arrived, she had managed to get dressed, gather the documents, her ID, their marriage certificate, from the safe deposit box, which she'd held maybe 3 times in 13 years, hand Chloe her backpack, and say goodbye at the door. Chloe reached up to hug her, and Emily held her daughter tighter than she'd intended, for 1 extra second, then let go. Helen arrived when Emily was already standing in the entryway in her jacket. "Stay strong, honey," her mother said, hugging her. "Mom, please, feed Chloe and take her to school." "I'll handle it, Em. Mom, please." Helen looked at her daughter, at that frozen, glassy stare and pressed lips, and didn't argue. She only said, "Call me the second you walk out of there." The air outside was fresh. The May morning smelled of new leaves and warming asphalt. Emily walked to the bus stop quickly, almost running, and the city around her seemed unreal, too bright, too alive, and completely out of sync with the turmoil inside her. People walked past with coffee in paper cups. Someone was laughing into their phone. 2 boys, maybe 10 years old, were racing their bikes along the edge of the sidewalk. A normal Wednesday. A normal morning for everyone but her. The bus came in 4 minutes. Emily sat by the window and watched the street, seeing nothing. The same thoughts spun in her head. Her last conversation with Andrew, 2 nights ago. He had called from his hotel, said he was tired, that the work was dragging on, that he'd bring Chloe the chocolate with almonds she'd asked for. A normal conversation. 7 minutes and 40 seconds. She had glanced at the screen after they hung up. Emily missed her stop. She realized it only after the bus had already pulled away from the intersection she needed. She jumped up and got off at the next one. An 8-minute walk back along a long block, past shops and pharmacies. She arrived at the medical examiner's office 20 minutes late. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman in glasses, greeted her professionally and with almost no sympathy, as people in such institutions do. Quick, functional, no unnecessary words. "Carter, ID, please. Proceed to room 3. You're expected." Emily walked down a hallway that smelled of bleach and something else. Something elusive that had no name but was unmistakably the scent of this place. The fluorescent lights overhead shone evenly and mercilessly, without shadows, without halftones. This light left no room for anything human. Emily thought that was probably intentional. In room 3, a middle-aged man met her. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded toward a chair by the desk. A file lay on the desk. "You need to identify the body of Andrew Carter," he said, "to confirm the identity for the issuance of a death certificate. Are you ready?" Emily nodded. The identification took a few minutes. They led her to an adjacent room, pointed. Emily looked at her husband's face and didn't let herself cry. Not because she was strong, but because everything inside her felt numb, had turned into one large, motionless knot that prevented her from breathing and thinking at the same time. Yes, that was him. That was Andrew. Her Andrew, 40 years old, strong hands, the first flecks of gray in his hair. He always joked that it suited him. He loved drinking coffee with cinnamon in the morning. Knew how to fix anything, from a child's bicycle to a leaky faucet. He hated watching sad movies. Once, 3 years ago, he spent an entire weekend building Chloe a dollhouse out of plywood, a little crooked, painted in 2 different shades of yellow because he ran out of paint, and Chloe loved it more than all her other toys, precisely because her dad had made it. "That's him," Emily said aloud. "Andrew Carter, my husband." They brought her back to the desk, pushed papers toward her. In the box for cause of death, it was typed, "Death resulting from a motor vehicle accident." Emily signed the form. Her hand didn't tremble. She simply couldn't feel it. They returned her ID, explained where to go for the death certificate, and gave her a timeline. Emily nodded, hearing almost nothing. Then she stood up, said a polite, automatic thank you, and walked toward the exit, down the same bleach-scented hallway. She had almost reached the door to the street when someone caught up to her. "Wait." The voice was young, hurried. Emily turned. A girl, no older than 25, in scrubs, with short brown hair and dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in nights. She glanced over her shoulder quickly, nervously, before stepping closer to Emily. "You're Mr. Carter's wife?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Yes. My name is Anna Hayes. I work here as a technician." She glanced back again. "Please, let's go outside. I need to tell you something. It's important." Emily looked at her. Something about this girl, not her voice, but something else, in her eyes, in the way she stood, made Emily stop instead of politely declining and leaving. "Okay," Emily said. They went out a side door into a small courtyard, an asphalt patch between the morgue building and a solid brick wall. No one was there. Anna Hayes pulled a phone from her pocket, glanced at the screen as if checking the time, and put it away. "If you had arrived on time," she began, "you would have heard it all yourself. You were 20 minutes late, and in that time, everything changed. You would have seen him, that man." "What changed?" Emily felt something shift inside her. "The cause of death for your husband?" Anna said quickly, almost swallowing her words. "This morning, before you got here, a man came to see Dr. Miller. He's our pathologist. I don't know who he was. Well-dressed, about 50, in an expensive suit. They were talking in his office. I was walking by. The door was ajar. This man was offering money, $50,000, to change the wording on the report. Emily didn't understand at first, and when she did, she didn't believe it. Change it how? The initial report had a different cause of death. not a car accident. Anna looked her straight in the eye, her gaze serious, almost frightened. After that man left, Dr. Miller asked me to step out. I did, but by the time you arrived, the altered papers were already in the file. I saw both versions. I saw them get replaced. Emily stood in the middle of the empty courtyard, feeling something irrevocably break in the version of the world she had inhabited just an hour ago. The world where her husband died in an accident, a world that was terrifying but explainable, where there was a clear, albeit unbearable, reason. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Anna Hayes paused for a second. "Because I have a husband, too," she said simply, "and a little boy." Emily looked at her, at this young woman in faded scrubs who had just risked something what Emily didn't yet understand, but she could feel it. Risked it not for personal gain, not out of a desire to be a hero in someone else's story, but simply because she couldn't stay silent. Because some things press on your chest unbearably if you keep them inside. "Can you confirm this officially?" Emily asked. "I'm willing to give a statement to a detective." Anna glanced around again. "Just do it quickly. I don't know how deep this all goes." She didn't finish, but Emily understood. "Okay," Emily said. Her voice was steady again, but now it was a different kind of steadiness, not numbness. Something else cold, sharp, the very specific clarity of a person who has just been given a purpose. She took out her phone and called her mother. "Mom," Emily said when Helen answered. "Andrew didn't die in an accident. Someone just told me. We need to talk. I'm coming to your place." Beyond the brick wall, the city hummed. Birds chirped. The May air was fragrant. And Emily Carter stood in the courtyard of the morgue and knew that her life had just been split into two parts. Not when she took the call that morning, but right here, at this moment. Because a husband's death in an accident is a tragedy. What she had just learned was something else entirely. Helen opened the door before Emily could even ring the bell. She was standing in the entryway as if she hadn't moved from the spot since her daughter had left. She was wearing a housecoat, holding a glass of cold tea that she clearly hadn't drunk. When Emily walked in, her mother looked at her with a single glance, that maternal look that requires no words and leaves no room for pretense, and silently set the glass on a small table. "Tell me," Helen said. Chloe was at school. The apartment was quiet. They sat in the kitchen, and Emily told her everything, from beginning to end, without skipping a detail. About the technician, Anna, the man in the suit, the $50,000, and the altered papers. She spoke evenly, almost without inflection, looking at her mother. Helen listened without interrupting, only once squeezing her daughter's hand when she paused, unable to continue. "Do you believe her?" Helen finally asked. "This girl from the morgue?" "Yes," Emily said. "I don't know why. I just do." Helen nodded. She knew to trust her daughter's intuition. Emily was rarely wrong about people. "Then the first thing you need to do is not wait," her mother said. "Don't think. Don't weigh your options. Don't ask anyone else. Go to the sheriff's department, the detectives. Today, now." "That's what I was thinking," Emily replied. "Do you know where it is?" "I'll find it." Helen stood up and poured fresh tea for Emily this time, not herself. She placed the mug in front of her daughter. Then she took a plate of sandwiches from the refrigerator, which she had obviously managed to make while she waited. Emily looked at them and realized she hadn't eaten anything since morning. Her stomach was a tight fist, but her mother was right. You can't go to the sheriff's department on an empty stomach, because you need to think clearly there. "Eat," Helen said, "and listen to me." She spoke calmly, but in that calmness was the firmness of someone who has made a decision and has no intention of backing down. You will not go in there as a grief-stricken widow who doesn't understand anything. You will go in as a person with specific information about a possible crime. Speak exactly like that. Don't cry in there. You can cry later. Emily looked at her mother. "You're amazing," she said quietly. "I've just lived longer than you," Helen replied. "It's almost the same thing." Emily ate a sandwich, drank the tea, then stood up, zipped her jacket, and left. This time, she didn't miss her stop. The county sheriff's department was housed in a 4-story, mid-century government building with high ceilings, long corridors, and bulletin boards on the walls covered with faded public notices. Emily approached the front desk and explained that she wanted to file a report about the possible concealment of a crime. The officer asked her to wait and made a phone call. The wait was about half an hour. Emily sat on a wooden bench along the wall, watching people come and go. Each had their own business, their own reason for being there. She thought that just yesterday morning, she couldn't have imagined herself in this place. Yesterday morning, she was thinking about signing Chloe up for the summer art classes she'd been asking for. Yesterday morning, her husband was a living person she was expecting home on Friday. Yesterday morning now seemed infinitely distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. A detective came out to meet her. Detective Mark Evans turned out to be a man in his 40s. Large, with a short haircut, wearing a light gray sport coat that sat a bit awkwardly on him as if it were a size too big. He had a broad face with sharp features and deep-set dark brown eyes that looked at Emily attentively and without excessive sympathy. Not because he didn't care, but because sympathy in his line of work was a luxury he had long learned to set aside. A worn wedding band was on his right hand. On his desk, next to a stack of papers, was a mug of long cold coffee that he never touched during their entire conversation. "Emily Carter?" he clarified. "This way." The office was small. A desk, 3 chairs, a filing cabinet, a window overlooking an inner courtyard. On the desk was a stack of documents, a plastic pen, a cup of pencils, nothing extraneous. Evans sat opposite her, opened a fresh form, and looked at Emily. "I'm listening." Emily told him everything for the second time that morning. This time, more precisely, more concretely, without pauses. She gave the technician's name, described the man Anna Hayes had seen, mentioned the sum of money, said that the report she signed listed a traffic accident, while, according to the witness, the original wording had been different. Evans listened without interrupting, writing quickly, with efficient movements. When Emily finished, he looked at the filled-out sheet for a few seconds, then raised his eyes to her. "Anna Hayes," he repeated. "Did you get her contact information?" "Yes." Emily took out her phone and showed him the number. "She said she's willing to give a statement." Evans nodded and wrote down the number. "All right, Mrs. Carter, I'll explain the procedure. I'm now registering your report of a crime. That's the mandatory first step. Based on this report, a formal inquiry will be initiated. As part of that, we will request all documentation from the medical examiner's office, interview witnesses, including Miss Hayes, and verify all the circumstances you've described." "How long will that take?" Emily asked. "By law, we have up to 30 days for an inquiry. But if the circumstances of the case are confirmed, we'll move faster." He looked at her directly. "You understand I can't promise you a specific outcome? I can only promise one thing. If there's a crime here, we'll find it." "That's enough for me," Emily said. Evans nodded. In that nod, there was neither promise nor refusal. Only a professional acknowledgement of fact. Emily realized he was exactly the person she needed. Not someone who would pat her on the back and offer comforting words. Someone who would do his job. The report was filed and registered that same day. On Thursday, the day after the call from the police, a full day after Andrew Carter's body had been delivered to the morgue, Evans acted quickly. By the end of the day, an official request had been sent to the medical examiner's office for all documentation related to the Carter case. Visitor logs, security camera recordings, original autopsy protocols, and their digital copies. In parallel, a meeting was scheduled with Anna Hayes. Anna came in the next morning, Friday, accompanied by Emily, whom Evans asked to wait in the hallway during the interview. Emily sat on the same wooden bench as the day before, staring at a poster about citizens' rights, not reading a word. She thought about Andrew, about how he had left for his business trip just a few mornings ago, kissed her, ruffled Chloe's hair, and said he'd be back with treats. The most ordinary goodbye. She hadn't even walked him to his car. She was busy, rushing to get to work. Now, she kept replaying that moment, thinking that if she had known, she would have gone out. She definitely would have. Anna was in the office for almost an hour. When she came out, her face was pale but calm. The kind of calm a person has after doing something frightening and irreversible, knowing there's no going back, but understanding they did the right thing. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked. "Yes," Anna said. "He's okay. Asked the right questions." A few minutes later, Evans came out and asked Emily to come in. "Ms. Hayes's testimony is consistent with yours," he said when Emily sat down. Furthermore, she described the man's appearance in enough detail. That's something. Now, about the documents. The ME's office sent over the materials. I can tell you this. The visitor log for that morning records a visit from an unauthorized person shortly before your arrival. Visitor's name, Peter Sullivan, 55 years old. According to security camera footage, he was indeed near pathologist Dr. Miller's office. Emily listened, feeling something inside her tighten into a point not from fear, but from the sense that a previously invisible mechanism was beginning to take shape. A name. A specific name, Peter Sullivan. "Who is he?" she asked. "We're still establishing that," Evans replied. "It will take time, but I can already say this. What you reported is not baseless. There are more than enough grounds to continue the inquiry." What happens next? We'll request the digital versions of the documents from the ME's office and compare them with the paper copies. We'll check if changes were made and when. We'll interview Dr. Miller. Evans paused. "And Mrs. Carter, this is important. Your husband's body cannot be released for burial yet. We may need a second autopsy." Emily nodded. She had already understood this herself. Still, when he said it out loud, something inside her clenched. Andrew was lying there, in that building with the bleach and the merciless fluorescent lights, and she couldn't bury him. She couldn't even do that one last thing for him. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. "I understand," she said. "You did the right thing," Evans said. It was the only personal phrase he had uttered the whole time, without inflection, almost businesslike. But, for some reason, it was those words that made Emily feel something inside her loosen slightly. "I didn't have another choice," she replied. "I have a daughter." She went out into the street, where Anna was waiting. They stood together for a few minutes, barely speaking. Then Anna said, "I'm glad you came here. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." "I believed you immediately," Emily said. Anna nodded and left. Emily watched her go. This young woman who had come to work on an ordinary Thursday and made a choice that changed everything. Emily didn't know what the consequences would be for Anna, but she knew she would never forget it. She called her mother. "The report was accepted," Emily said. "The detective seems capable. They're working on it." "Thank God," Helen breathed out. How's Chloe?" "She's back from school, ate, doing her homework. She asked where you were. I said you were running errands." "Okay, I'll be home soon." Her mother's voice grew quieter. "How are you?" Emily looked at the street. A warm May evening. People were returning home from work. A group of young people were laughing on a nearby street. "I'm angry," she said. "I guess that's a good thing. Better than nothing." She put her phone away and walked to the bus stop. Somewhere in the city existed a man named Peter Sullivan. A man who had walked into a morgue and offered $500,000 to turn her husband's murder into an accident on paper. Emily didn't know his face, didn't know where he lived or what he did. But now he had a name, and that was a start. Emily spent the weekend at home, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The investigation was underway. Nothing was required of her for now, and this waiting was perhaps harder than everything else. Worse than the call from the police, worse than the morgue, worse than signing the form, this waiting, when you know something important is happening somewhere, but you're not part of it and can only wait. Helen moved in with them for those days, unofficially, without explanation. She just showed up on Saturday morning with a bag and took over the kitchen. She cooked, washed dishes, took Chloe to play in the yard, and never once asked Emily how she was feeling. It was wise. Emily wouldn't have known what to say. They told Chloe that her dad had been in an accident and that he had died. They said it simply, without extra words, because Chloe was exactly the kind of child for whom a lie doesn't help, only confuses. The little girl listened and stared at her mother for a few seconds, completely still, as if the words hadn't reached her immediately but with a delay, like a distant sound. Then her face broke, not gradually, but all at once, sharply, like something fragile breaking from a single, careless movement. She cried the way children who haven't yet learned to hold back cry loudly, choking, pressing her fists to her eyes. Emily knelt in front of her, right on the floor, and hugged her. And Chloe clung to her with both arms, tightly, desperately, the way you cling to something you're afraid of losing next. "Will he come back?" Chloe asked through her tears, though she seemed to already know the answer. She just couldn't help but ask. "No, sweetie," Emily said. "He won't come back." Chloe started crying again, even harder, with that heart-wrenching, almost physical grief that only happens in childhood, when the irreparable is experienced for the first time and there are no words or defenses for it yet. Emily held her and said nothing, because there were no words that could help. She just stroked her daughter's hair and felt herself not crying. Not because it didn't hurt, but because one of them had to hold it together. That evening, Emily found Chloe in her room. The girl was lying on her bed, facing the wall, her shoulders trembling slightly. She was still crying, almost silently now, the way you cry from exhaustion when the tears run out but the grief doesn't. On the pillow next to her was a photograph, the one from the lake house last summer, where she and her dad were both laughing. Emily lay down beside her, moved closer, and Chloe didn't say a word, just turned and buried her face in her mother's shoulder. They lay like that for a long time, until the girl's breathing finally evened out and she fell asleep, still holding the photograph. Emily didn't move for a long time after Chloe was asleep. On Sunday, Chloe suddenly asked at breakfast, not addressing anyone in particular, staring into her bowl of oatmeal, "Is Dad only going to be in pictures now?" Helen, who was standing by the stove, turned to the window. Emily looked at her daughter, at that serious, unchildishly focused gaze, and answered honestly, "Yes, sweetie, from now on, only in pictures. But that doesn't mean he's gone. He's here, just in a different way." "In your heart," Chloe thought for a second. Then she nodded and picked up her spoon. Children have a way of accepting the irreparable, with a quiet seriousness that adults have long forgotten. Emily looked at her daughter and thought, "This is what I'll hold on to. This is who I won't let myself fall for." They didn't talk about murder with Chloe. It wasn't her burden to bear, not yet. On Monday morning, Detective Evans called. "Mrs. Carter, I need to inform you. The comparative analysis of the documents is complete. The digital version of the autopsy report was altered that morning. The timestamp of the last edit is recorded 40 minutes before your arrival at the medical examiner's office. The paper version you signed matches the altered digital one. The original version was deleted, but we managed to recover it from the server." "What did the original say?" Emily asked. "I can't disclose that to you right now. It's part of the ongoing inquiry. But I can tell you this. There is more than sufficient grounds to order a second forensic autopsy. I will be issuing the relevant order today. Your husband's body will be transferred to the State Forensics Institute. A panel of several experts will work on it there." "When will that be?" "The transfer of the body is scheduled for tomorrow, Tuesday. The examination will take several days. I will notify you of the results personally." After finishing the call, Emily stared out the window for a long time. Then she stood up, went out onto the balcony, and just stood there in the silence, in the May air, with her eyes closed. She gave herself exactly 3 minutes. Then she went back inside. Helen looked at her questioningly, silently. "They found confirmation," Emily said. "They've ordered a second autopsy." Her mother made a quick, almost imperceptible sign of the cross. It was the only time Emily had ever seen her pray. On Tuesday, Andrew Carter's body was officially transferred under guard and delivered to the State Forensics Institute, an institution with a nondescript gray facade on the outskirts of the city that Emily had never noticed before, though she had probably driven past it dozens of times. Detective Evans personally oversaw the transfer procedure. Emily wasn't present. She wasn't asked to be, and she was grateful for that. The days stretched on again. Emily went to work. She was a dispatcher for a small logistics company, and her boss, an elderly man with a quiet voice, told her she could take as much time off as she needed. Emily took 2 days and returned. Not because she was ready, but because being at home was becoming unbearable. Work demanded her attention and left no room for the thoughts that would otherwise occupy all the space inside her. Her colleagues knew and treated her with that delicate caution people have when they don't know what to say but want to show their support. No one pried. A few times, a cup of tea appeared on her desk without explanation, just there. Emily noticed and was grateful. In the evenings, when Chloe was asleep and Helen had gone to the other room, Emily would sit in the dark in the kitchen, without turning on the light, and allow herself what she didn't during the day. She didn't cry. For some reason, the tears wouldn't come, as if something inside had shut off that valve back on that morning at the morgue and refused to let go. She just sat and thought about Andrew. She remembered not how he died, but how he lived, how he laughed, how he could only cook one dish, scrambled eggs with tomatoes, and did it with such ceremony as if it were the most complex culinary feat. How once, when she and Chloe were both sick and Chloe couldn't sleep, he sat with her in his arms all night long, quietly telling her made-up stories about a talking hedgehog. How he smelled of pine soap and a little bit of motor oil, because he was always fixing something. These memories were unbearable, and, at the same time, the only thing keeping her afloat. 9 days after she had received the call from the police, Detective Evans asked her to come in. Emily walked into his office at 2:30 in the afternoon. The detective stood up from his desk when she entered, for the first time in their acquaintance. That in itself was strange. Emily understood, before hearing a single word, that something important was about to happen. "Sit down, Mrs. Carter." She sat. Evans opened a file. He paused for a second, not for dramatic effect, but like a man accustomed to the weight of words, choosing the right moment to speak them. "The panel's forensic examination is complete," he said. "The report is signed by 3 independent experts. I am obligated to inform you of the main conclusions." Emily nodded. She looked at him and didn't blink. "The experts identified a number of injuries that are not characteristic of a typical motor vehicle accident," Evans continued. "Specifically, signs of a struggle were recorded. Injuries inflicted prior to the staged accident. The mechanics of the trauma do not align with the version of a vehicle collision. Furthermore, traces of an impact were discovered that were either intentionally or negligently omitted from the initial report." Emily listened, a quiet ringing in her ears, not from shock, but from the fact that everything she had believed for the past 9 days was now receiving official, documented, irrefutable confirmation. "The final conclusion of the panel," Evans said, "is as follows. The death of Andrew Carter was violent in nature. The motor vehicle accident was a staging." The office was quiet. Outside the window, the street hummed. A door slammed somewhere down the hall. Emily looked at the file in front of Evans. In that file was a document that turned everything upside down. Not just an official paper. It was the answer to the question she had been asking herself every day since Anna Hayes caught up with her in the morgue hallway. Now the answer was there. 3 signatures. 3 independent experts. Staging. That meant the man in the expensive suit who came to the morgue with money knew he wasn't covering up an accidental death. He was covering up a murder. Based on this conclusion, the detective continued, a criminal case was opened today under the charge of murder. Additionally, for the facts of bribery and official misconduct, Dr. Miller has been summoned for questioning. Peter Sullivan has been identified and is under surveillance. "He was murdered," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Yes," Evans replied, "it's a homicide, and we will investigate it as such." Emily placed her hands on her knees and squeezed her fingers tightly. For a few seconds, she just breathed, evenly, slowly, forcing herself not to lose the thread. "Who did it?" she asked. "The investigation does not yet have enough data to fully answer that question, but we are working on it." Evans looked at her. "Mrs. Carter, I want you to understand, you did what needed to be done. You came here that same day. If you had delayed, the documents could have disappeared for good. The witness might have changed her mind. The body could have been buried. You didn't delay." Emily looked at him. There was no praise in his words, only a precise, professional assessment of what had happened. That's what made them carry weight. "I couldn't have done otherwise," she said. "I know," Evans replied. And in those 2 words, there was something not sympathy, not admiration, but a quiet, calm acknowledgement that made Emily understand he wasn't just working the case. He felt it. She left the sheriff's department building at 4 in the afternoon. The street greeted her with noise and the smell of hot asphalt. And that smell was so ordinary, so incompatible with what was happening inside her, that Emily stopped for a second right in the middle of the sidewalk. Passers-by walked around her. No one paid any attention. She took out her phone and dialed her mother. "Mom," Emily said, when Helen answered. They confirmed it. It was murder. They've opened a case. Helen was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, in a voice that was a mixture of relief and grief, in a proportion impossible to describe, "So the truth will come out." "Yes," Emily said. "It will." She put her phone away and walked to the bus stop. Behind her was the sheriff's department building. Ahead was her home, where her daughter and mother were waiting, where Andrew's empty work bag, brought back with his things, sat in the hall, where his razor still lay on the shelf in the bathroom. Emily walked and thought that now, for the first time in these 9 days, she had more than just grief. She had something else, something that kept her from giving up and staring at the floor. There was a criminal case. There was a detective doing his job. There were 9 days of fighting that had led her right here. And there were 3 signatures under a report that said, this was murder. Now it was official. The next few days, Emily lived in a state that could be called waiting, if that word didn't seem too passive. It was more like a taut, ringing tension, like a string pulled to its limit, ready to either resonate or snap at any moment. She went to work, picked Chloe up from school, made dinner, put her daughter to bed. Life on the outside looked almost normal. Inside, everything was different. Evans called on Wednesday of the following week, after the conversation in his office when he had reported the autopsy results. He asked her to come in that afternoon. His voice was as steady as ever, but Emily had learned to hear the nuances in that steadiness. And today there was something new, not urgency, more like significance. She arrived at 3 o'clock. Evans met her in the hallway, not waiting in his office, and led her to the now familiar desk with its files and cup of pencils. "Mrs. Carter, the investigation has established a motive," he said. "I'm obligated to inform you, as it directly concerns your husband." Emily didn't reply, just waited. A few days before his death, Andrew Carter gave a statement in connection with another criminal case. Evans said, speaking clearly, without unnecessary pauses, he witnessed an intentional hit-and-run. It happened in the city he was visiting on business 3 days before the trip on which he died. He saw a vehicle deliberately strike a pedestrian. The victim died at the scene. Your husband was the only disinterested witness to the event and gave a statement to the detective handling that case. Emily stared at Evans. In her mind, slowly, like parts of a mechanism, things she hadn't understood before were clicking into place. After Mr. Carter gave his statement, the detective continued, he became a dangerous witness for the suspect in that case. The elimination of the witness was organized swiftly. It appears the suspect had the resources and connections for such actions. The murder was committed and disguised as a traffic accident. Simultaneously, an attempt was made to conceal the true cause of death by bribing the pathologist. The office was quiet. Emily could hear her own breathing. "He just said what he saw," she finally uttered. More to herself than to Evans, he saw someone get killed, and he didn't stay silent. "That's all." "Yes," Evans said. "Exactly." Emily thought about Andrew, about the kind of man he was. He never knew how to just walk by. It was a trait that sometimes annoyed her in everyday life. He could stop and spend half an hour helping a stranger fix their car on the side of the road. He would go back to a store to return extra change he'd been given by mistake. He didn't make a big deal out of it. For him, it was just normal, the way things should be. He saw a murder and went to give a statement, not because he was a hero, but because he didn't know how to be any other way, and it got him killed. "Who was the client?" Emily asked. "The suspect in the first murder case, a man with significant financial resources. His identity has been established by the investigation. He was detained this morning." Evans paused. Peter Sullivan acted as the middleman between the client and the perpetrators. He organized both your husband's murder and the attempt to bribe the pathologist. Sullivan was arrested last night. The word arrested. Emily heard it the way one might hear a gunshot after a long, exhausting wait. Sharp, concrete, with no possibility of rewinding. He's in custody? She clarified. Yes. The court has ordered him held without bail. There are no grounds for his release. Emily nodded. Something in her chest was slowly unclenching, not joy, not triumph, something else. As if a coiled spring she had been holding inside for the past 2 weeks had finally allowed itself to relax slightly. Dr. Miller, she said. The pathologist was interrogated yesterday. Evans opened a file and continued without looking at the papers. Dr. Miller admitted that pressure was put on him, that Sullivan offered him $50,000 to change the wording in the report, that he accepted the money and altered the document. He also admitted he understood what he was doing. So he knew it was a murder, Emily said. Her voice held no question. He knew the cause of death was different from what he stated. He didn't have full information about the client, but he knew enough. Emily was silent. Dr. Miller. She had never seen him, only heard his name in her first conversation with Anna Hayes, a middle-aged man in a white coat who sat in his office and weighed $50,000 against someone else's truth. She didn't know what he told himself in that moment. Maybe he convinced himself it didn't matter, that a dead man wouldn't care what was written in his file. Maybe he thought about his debts or his children, or just the money that would solve some personal problem. But he hadn't thought about one thing, that the dead man had a wife and a daughter, and for them, it was not all the same. He's been charged? Emily asked. Yes. Official misconduct and accepting a bribe. Evans looked at her. Mrs. Carter, I know this is all difficult, but I want you to understand the full picture. Your husband died because he testified in another man's murder case. He did what every citizen is supposed to do, and it cost him his life. It's monstrous. And that's precisely why we are obligated to see this through to the end. Emily looked at him for a long moment, then said, The man who was hit in the other city, did he have a family? Evans paused for a second. Yes, a wife and 2 children. Emily closed her eyes for a few seconds. So there were 2 of them, 2 men, killed by the same decision of one person with financial resources and a complete lack of what is commonly called a conscience. 2 husbands, 2 fathers, and several orphaned families who, until recently, didn't even know of each other's existence. I see, Emily said finally. What do I need to do now? For now, nothing. The investigation has everything it needs. Your statement is on record. Miss Hayes's is as well. The expert's conclusion is in the file. I will soon formalize your legal status as the victim in the murder case. That will give you the right to review the case materials and participate in the trial. When will the trial be? It will take time. The investigation isn't over yet, but we're moving quickly. Emily stood up and shook Evans's hand for the first time since they had met. He shook it back firmly, professionally, without any undue ceremony. The funeral took place the day after the detective officially authorized the release of the body. This happened after the criminal case was opened, when the second autopsy was complete. All necessary legal procedures with the body had been conducted, and Evans had signed the corresponding order. Emily handled the arrangements that same day, methodically, without tears, with a list on her phone. Funeral home, death certificate, cemetery plot, wreaths, a bus for those who wanted to come. Helen was by her side, answering calls when Emily couldn't speak, taking notes, rechecking details. They worked together like a well-oiled machine. And only late at night, when everything was settled and the list on her phone was closed, did Emily go out onto the balcony and stand there in the darkness for a long time, not moving, not thinking about anything specific. About 30 people came to the funeral. Andrew's colleagues from the construction firm, a few of his old friends, neighbors, relatives. Emily stood by the casket, straight in a dark blazer, with Chloe beside her. Her daughter didn't cry. She had cried it all out in those first days, and now just held her mother's hand, looking at her father seriously, without looking away, as if trying to memorize his face forever. Someone said some words proper, warm, genuine. Emily heard them as if through glass. She looked at Andrew and thought that here he lay, the very man who couldn't just walk by, who one day saw someone else's misfortune and didn't stay silent. And that this was exactly what had killed him. And it was also what was allowing her to stand here now, tall, without lowering her head. Helen stood slightly behind, holding Chloe by the shoulders when the girl finally did cry, quietly burying her face in her grandmother's sleeve. Emily turned, looked at them, her mother and daughter, and felt something sharp and quiet at the same time. Not loneliness, something opposite. The casket was lowered into the ground at noon, when the sun was high and the shadows were short. Emily tossed a handful of dirt, as is customary, and took a step back. Chloe came and stood beside her, took her hand. They stood for a little longer, then turned and walked away. Andrew was buried. It was right. Finally, right. With his own name, with his truth, without someone else's lie in the documents. On the way from the cemetery, Emily just walked and thought about Andrew. About the conversation he must have had with the detective in the other city, calmly, thoroughly recounting what he saw. She pictured him in an unfamiliar office, in an unfamiliar city, a little tired after a day's work, in his work jacket, with his phone in his pocket, holding unread messages from her and Chloe. He sat there and told it all, just as it was, because that was the right thing to do. He didn't know what would follow. He couldn't have known. Or maybe he felt something, an anxiety, a worry, some unclear signal he couldn't decipher in time. Emily didn't know. She would never know. And yet she thought, what if he did know? What if he understood that something had changed after that testimony? That someone had started looking his way? What if there was something in that last phone call, in those 7 minutes and 40 seconds, that she hadn't heard, had missed, had dismissed as fatigue? Some pause, some intonation. She stopped herself at this thought every time and every time let it go. Because that path led nowhere. Because blaming herself for what she couldn't have known wasn't honoring Andrew's memory. It was just pain for pain's sake. But she knew something else. She knew that Andrew had acted as honest people do, and that his honesty had cost him his life. And that was precisely why she had gone to the sheriff's department that same day. That's why she hadn't stayed silent, hadn't backed down, hadn't convinced herself that she didn't need this, that it was easier to bury her husband as an accident victim and try to move on. Because Andrew hadn't stayed silent, and she couldn't do any less. Emily stopped at a corner, pulled out her phone, and dialed Anna Hayes. She answered after the second ring. "Anna," Emily said, "I buried my husband, the way he deserved. Sullivan has been arrested. A case has been opened. I wanted you to know." There was a moment of silence on the line. Then Anna said quietly, "Thank God." "I want to thank you," Emily continued. "You realize that without you, none of this would have happened." "I just couldn't walk by," Anna said. "Like your husband, I guess." Emily paused. The comparison hit exactly where it needed to. "Yes," she said, "just like him." Emily walked down the sidewalk and heard in those words what she had been missing all these days. Not an explanation, not comfort, but something more precise and important, an understanding of who her husband was, a man who remained himself to the very end. That evening, when Chloe was asleep, Emily sat in the dark in the kitchen, as she had done for several nights in a row. But tonight was different. Not the numb, heavy silence of the first days, but something more alive. She thought about Andrew, and for the first time, she thought not about his death, but about his life, about who he was, about what she loved in him. Chloe would have to know not only that her dad was gone, but also what kind of man he was. That he didn't just work, provide for his family, and fix bicycles. That one day he was in the right place at the right time and didn't turn away. That his life ended precisely because he was that kind of person. When the time was right, Emily would tell her. Everything, just as it was. The trial began in September. By then, almost 4 months had passed since that May morning when Emily had stood in the morgue courtyard, listening to the hurried whispers of a young technician. 4 months, a period in which you can get used to almost anything. Emily got used to the empty hangar in the hall where Andrew's jacket used to hang. She got used to answering the question, "How's your husband?" from people who didn't yet know. Briefly, without details, without tears. She got used to falling asleep alone in a room where his books still stood on the shelf. Chloe became quieter, not withdrawn, Not that she stopped laughing, but something in her had grown up too soon and taken the place that used to be occupied by carefree joy. She still drew, still fought with Jessica from second grade and made up with her the next day. But sometimes, in the evenings, she would come to Emily, sit beside her, and just be silent, leaning her shoulder against her. Emily would put an arm around her and be silent too. It was enough for both of them. Helen came over every other day, bringing food, sitting with Chloe while Emily was at work or at the sheriff's department. She never said anything unnecessary, not about how to live now, not about time healing all wounds. She was just there. Emily sometimes thought that her mother, at 62, understood something about life that most people never grasp in their entire lives. Detective Evans kept Emily informed throughout the investigation, briefly, factually, without unnecessary details. The case was built methodically, like a complex machine: testimonies, forensic reports, lineups, financial audits. It turned out that the client, the owner of a large development company, a man with connections and a habit of solving problems with money, had committed the first hit and run while intoxicated. Andrew was the only one who saw everything from start to finish and was willing to talk about it. Other potential witnesses had, for various reasons, declined to testify. Andrew hadn't. It was his final act of honesty, and it had cost him his life. And in the end, it cost those who killed him their freedom. The courthouse was an old building with columns at the entrance and creaky floors in the hallways. Emily attended every session, wearing a gray blazer and carrying a folder of documents prepared by the court-appointed lawyer representing her as the victim's next of kin. The lawyer was young, businesslike, and clearly knew his job. At the first hearing, he told her, "Emily, the evidence is ironclad. Our job is to make sure it doesn't get muddied." Emily agreed without a word. At the first session, she saw Peter Sullivan. He was exactly as she had imagined, and at the same time, completely different. 55 years old, heavy-set, with a strong jaw, he stared straight ahead and never once turned his head toward Emily, not that day, not on any of the following days. She looked at him and tried to find hatred within herself. She couldn't. There was something else, cold, calm, almost impersonal, not toward him as a person, but toward what he had done, toward the cynical, businesslike ease with which he had walked into a morgue with an envelope and tried to erase a murder like a typo in a document. A corrected line. That's what it looked like from his side. Just a corrected line in a piece of paper. Dr. Miller sat on another bench, separate from Sullivan and the client. Dr. Miller, 53 years old, a pathologist with 20 years of experience. At the first hearing, he looked at no one. At the second, he raised his eyes once and met Emily's gaze. He held it for a second, then looked down. She did not look away. There were 7 sessions in total, each lasting several hours. Emily sat, listened, looked at the folders of evidence the prosecutor read from, and thought about how all of this, every page, every expert signature, every timestamp on the altered file had started because a young woman in faded scrubs had caught up with her in a morgue hallway and said, "Wait." Anna Hayes was also present at the hearings as a witness. She testified at the 3rd session, standing straight, speaking evenly, not looking at Sullivan. When she finished and returned to her seat, Emily gave her a grateful look. Anna gave a short, professional nod. They had both long since moved beyond the roles they had started with a widow and a random witness. Now it was something else. Not friendship in the usual sense, but something stronger. A shared truth they had dragged into the light together. The verdict was announced at the end of September. Emily sat on the bench for the victim's family and listened as the judge read a long, detailed text in a dry, even voice, without inflection. She heard every word, and at the same time, she heard something else, a silence, behind all those words in which Andrew stood, not as an image, not as a memory, but as a presence. As if he were there too, listening. "The court has established," the judge read, "that the murder of Andrew Carter was committed with premeditation and by prior conspiracy for the purpose of eliminating a witness in a criminal case. The motor vehicle accident was a staging. The organizer of the murder was the client, with Peter Sullivan acting as the intermediary. Sullivan was convicted. The client was convicted. Dr. Miller lost his position and was sentenced for official misconduct and accepting a bribe. When the judge finished reading, there was a moment of silence in the courtroom. Then a restrained, business-like hum began. Lawyers conferred. Bailiffs led the convicted men away. Someone coughed in the back corner. Emily didn't move. Her lawyer leaned over. "Emily, are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." She walked out of the courthouse into the bright September afternoon. Anna came and stood beside her. They stood in silence for a minute, no more. Then Anna said, "Well, that's it." "Yes," Emily agreed. Then she called her mother. "It's over, Mom," she said. "The verdict is in. They've been convicted." Helen began to cry quietly, almost silently, the way people cry when they've been holding on for a long time and finally let themselves go. Emily listened and felt something in herself start to let go, too. Slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid to start too soon. "Is Chloe home?" Emily asked. "Yes. She's back from school, she's drawing. I'll be home soon." She put her phone away and stood for a while on the steps, looking out at the street. People walked by, cars drove past. A streetcar bell rang on a nearby street. The city was living its life, beautiful in its ordinariness. Emily walked down the steps and started home. A few days later, she took Chloe and drove to the cemetery with flowers that her daughter had picked out herself at a flower shop. She chose yellow and white chrysanthemums because, as she said, Dad liked things to be pretty, but not too fancy. They stood by the grave together. Chloe held her mother's hand and looked at the photo of her father in its frame. Seriously, intently, the way a person looks when they want to remember. "Mom," Chloe said, "why didn't Dad run away? When he realized it was dangerous?" Emily looked at her daughter, at this little person with big questions, honest, direct, with no allowance for her age. "Because he wasn't built that way," Emily replied. "He saw something wrong, and he couldn't just walk by." Chloe thought for a second. "Is that a good thing?" she asked. "Yes," Emily said. "It's a very good thing. It just costs a lot sometimes." Chloe nodded with the same seriousness she had shown all summer when she received answers that were too big for a 7-year-old, but there were no others. They stood a little longer, placed the chrysanthemums, stood in silence. On the way back, Chloe suddenly said, "I'm going to tell Jessica about Dad. She doesn't know what he was like." "You should do that," Emily said, and smiled. For the first time in a very long time, a real smile, not for anyone else, not to comfort or encourage, just a smile. The official documents were reissued. Andrew Carter had died not because of bad luck, but because he was in the right time, in the right place, and acted with integrity. The line had been corrected, the truth had been restored, and that, Emily thought, was the only thing she could do for him now. She had done it,